Hello, I'm Sean Wilson. I'm the SCNCA president, and I'm here with Drew, who is a first-year graduate student at USC, and he's been working with us to develop surveys, and this is the first one that we've put together. And this one's going to give you a bit of demographics that we put together, as well as the survey report that we can just finish conducting. Drew, you want to say a couple words?
Yeah, so this is a survey that Sean and I have been developing based on a similar feedback survey that was developed in the Northeast to look at what competitive cyclists and non-competitive cyclists alike are interested in when it comes to cycling events.
Oh, there we go. So we drew down some initial demographics from the USA Cycling website. And so the number of riders that we have in 2017 are about 2,500 men and about 400 women. And that's been pretty stable for a couple of years. Though we see some drop off in the number of rider days. So the number of racing cyclists in Southern California, this shows the number of athletes versus their age. And this was conducted this was information that was brought down from USA Cycling recently, and it's really interesting to see that we just see an increase in riders as they become older until their mid-30s, and we see a small drop-off, and then they ramp up again when you go over into the late 40s and early 50s. And overall, it's still about the same proportion of female riders to males across a wide range of different ages. This is a little bit complex slide. I'm not going to go through all the details. Overall, though, the number of rider days is down about 30%, even though we have about 4,000 or about 3,000 to 3,500 licenses currently in our district. When we looked at the participants that were involved in the SCNCA survey, what we found is that the demographics actually pretty well matched the demographics for the Southern California region as a whole, though we had quite a few less number of respondents compared to the total number of racers in our region. This is a really interesting slide which actually shows the number of licenses over a period of years, and each of the lines is actually the riders, tracing the riders as they maintained or did not maintain their license from year to year. So if we just look at the first year, 2001, over on the left-hand side, what you see is that in the first year we brought in about 450 riders, and by the third year there were only about 50 to 100 riders left. And so this seems to be true across all the different years where we seem to only retain about 10% of the athletes after the first few years of racing. So that's a real issue in our region that we're not able to retain riders, even though we can recruit quite a few every year to take out a new license. So this goes into the survey results themselves, and Drew, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So we got a total of about Sean, I believe it was 400 riders total? Yeah.
It was a little bit less than 400, but the total number of respondents across the different things is about 330 riders. Yeah. So not everybody responded to every single question.
Yeah, let's go back to the summary there real quick. I misplaced the slides in my mind. So there are a few really interesting things that we saw from getting feedback from our riders, and one was that the riders seem to express a common sentiment of wanting a shorter race season that's more strictly defined. More variety in race courses. Something I'm sure many of us have heard before is an increase in road races. If you were around this year, you noticed that there weren't as many road races that there had been previously. And then another interesting note was making races more events more tailored to a family outing with greater vendor participation, food trucks. As far as what riders found to be important in the races they selected, surprisingly, prize lists were not critical, and the SoCal Cup was also not critical. So now we can go back to the demographics of our respondents. So this is pretty representative of, our rider makeup. The majority were road riders that took our survey. Surprisingly, we only had a few collegiate or NICA respondents, and 83% of the respondents currently have a racing license. Interestingly, in our region, most of the road riders that took this survey were fairly advanced, so the majority of them were Cat 3 riders, whereas you see pretty much a similar number between beginner racers and more elite 1-2 racers participating. However, despite this majority more experienced rider response, we had a fairly even distribution of racers who raced either very little during the past year or a lot. Sean, did you want to talk about PRP clinics?
Sure. One of the major thrusts that we have here in Southern California, and in Northern California they do this as well, is that we have quite a few clinics and beginning racer program events, and they were actually fairly well attended. We don't drill into the exact demographics here in terms of what categories, but based on when I looked over the data, it looked like we not only had Category 5s attending these events, but we also had upper category riders attending the clinics and BRP sessions, and some of them were attending as mentors, and so they were actively helping new riders learn the sport. So when we jump over and we look at which events the riders thought were their favorites, it should be no surprise that CBR came up at the top of the list, and part of this I think was due to proximity, which we'll get into in a little bit. But other larger races also came up to the top of the heap here: Manhattan Beach, San Dimas, and Dana Point. Some other ones that were notable in there are the 805 races, and then Redlands also showed up.
And I think, Sean, if there's something I wanted to add on this, what I think is really interesting is that the majority of these events are events that are really tailored to be family events that include some of the things that we talked about in the summary already.
So the favorite bike racing events were fun, actually comes up to pretty high up the list. Great courses, that they're well organized, that you have a promoter that can organize things, that they're safe venues. People like to have a challenge, though clearly, some of the events like CBR aren't necessarily a challenge. So, fun event is winning out over that. And location. The location is actually really important. So why did somebody actually choose one race over another one? Up at the top of this is the proximity or location and the time of the event, which would have to do with how much travel time that they're going to have to get there and what time during the day that occurs. The course is really important. And then having competition. The riders actually like to compete against one another, and they want to have more racers there. So things that bring in more racers is good. We asked about the categories that were involved and the idea of having a dedicated field for their category, and it's important. They want to make sure that they're racing against their peers. They don't want to be in mixed fields with people that are either way above them or way below. They want to be in a dedicated field. I've already talked about the proximity of the event and how that's very important to the racers, but you can see that here it's kind of a bell-shaped curve, is that some people are willing to drive to get to events, and that's where we just have to weigh out whether the event has a course or a venue that is viewed as being really cool, and then they're willing to drive to go to it. The race distance, so this is how long is a person's race. It's very important. If the races are too short, they don't want to go. They want to make sure that they're racing distances that are reflective of their category and of their ability levels. They don't want to be racing things that are too short. That was the main comment, was that a lot of the races are too short. This goes into what Drew was talking about, how the prize list not being very critical. Clearly, some people like to have the prizes, but overall, it's not viewed as being the most important thing. It's much more important to have a good course that's close by. The time of day, it's very important. A lot of the athletes that we're dealing with are masters athletes, and they have a lot of family commitments. Or their parents, and they have a lot of other commitments, and they want to have time to be able to go do other things during the course of the day. They don't want to be trapped or feel like they're trapped at a venue. And that's where the idea of having other things there that provide a fun family atmosphere could actually help keep people around longer during the day. Interestingly, the SoCal Cup was not viewed as being very important. There's been a lot of discussion about the SoCal Cup, and I'm sure that we'll have more discussion in the future. But this was just the survey result is saying that it's not as important as a lot of other things in terms of what drives them to actually do an event. And we broke this down by their category, and what you find is that it's pretty well across the board. That the SoCal Cup is not that critical, whether they're a Category 1, 2 rider or a Category 4 or 5 rider. It doesn't matter all that much. The course that they race on is viewed as being very important. They want courses that are challenging, they want courses that are interesting, and they want new courses, or even bringing back old venues, which can be tricky. But they want these things to happen. We asked about whether or not a race series for their category may be important. And the idea here was that we want to know whether if a certain race, take CBR, has a race series for the Category 3 riders, whether that's going to help attract the riders back to that race over and over again. And it looks like we had mixed responses. So either the question wasn't that great, or maybe they don't care all that much overall. And so this is something that we should revisit in the future and discuss more thoroughly. When we asked some specific questions about what they wanted at the events, road race events came far and away above everything else. Having food vendors, having defined race seasons were viewed as being very important. Some of the other things like skills clinics, interscholastic racing, cyclocross, those are important too, but not as much as having road race events, which have pretty much fallen by the wayside here in Southern California. So what do riders want? They want events. They want to be able to go to a venue and have it be more than just a bike race. They want to have food trucks. They want to have other things to do at that venue other than just the bike race. Road races, we've talked about that quite a bit. They definitely want more road races. They want variety in the courses that they do. They specifically talked about not having industrial park criteriums. They want more than that. They talked about having a shortened racing season and specifically starting later, not starting in early January, starting later and then continuing through the summer and into the early fall. There was a lot of responses about women's racing opportunities and making sure that was taken care of. And then when we look at the wordle here, is that there's other things in there about the field sizes, and then not just having criteriums, and making sure that there's that the time of day is taken into consideration for the racers. So in summary, which we've already kind of driven at, SoCal racers actually want to see a change towards having a defined racing season, possibly shorter racing season, with races starting later in the year. One person specifically said not before Valentine's Day. They want higher variety in the races with new courses, and specifically they want more road races. They want the races to become events with greater vendor participation. They want to make it, they were talking about it being easy for vendors to go to the event, to the races, so that they could actually make it much more fun. And then there was a lot of people talking about food trucks. And then the real surprises that came out were that prize lists aren't as critical as we might have thought, and the SoCal Cup is also not maybe as critical as we've as we've thought in the past. Anything else to add, Drew?
No, I think you covered it. I did want to say thank you to all of our wonderful respondents. This is really an ongoing project for us, and Sean and I are just beginning to understand how can we best deliver what the racers want and make cycling in Southern California as enjoyable for either families or the actual participants themselves. So thank you so much.
Thank you, and good night.